He woke up that morning to the same suffocating feeling that seemed to hang over the house like a thick fog. The sun peeked through the curtains, but it did little to chase away the tension that had become almost a permanent resident in the home. Living with his stepdad had never been easy, but lately it felt unbearable. Every little action, every word, every glance seemed to be measured and judged. The stepdad was a man who demanded respect, but not in the usual sense. He expected obedience to the point where it felt more like fear than respect. Breakfast was always tense. The stepdad sat at the head of the table, the chair acting as a throne of authority. His biological son was next to him, smirking as if the world was supposed to revolve around him. The protagonist, meanwhile, sat quietly, careful to avoid any action that might provoke anger. Even so, there was a sense of injustice that gnawed at him constantly. The stepdad had recently introduced a new rule and expectation that the protagonist should bow slightly whenever addressing or speaking to his son. It wasn't something spoken openly at first, but it was enforced subtly, through scornful looks and small punishments when ignored. To the protagonist, it felt humiliating. No one should have to show such forced deference simply because of birthright. He tried to act as though it didn't bother him, swallowing the lump in his throat every time. His eyes met the stepdad's. Every bite of food was a careful calculation. Not too fast, not too slow, not too eager, not too casual. A wrong move could bring a scolding, a punishment, or worse. His mother, often caught between the two worlds, tried to mediate, but her words fell like whispers in a storm. She loved both of them, but there was only so much she could do. Her eyes often lingered on him during breakfast, filled with a silent apology for a world that seemed determined to make him suffer. The protagonist's mind wandered as he chewed, thinking about the unfairness of it all. He had tried reasoning with the stepdad before, but words never worked. The man had a rigid way of thinking, convinced that authority must be absolute, unquestionable. Any sign of hesitation or disagreement was seen as rebellion. The stepdad's son, meanwhile, seemed to enjoy the power imbalance, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin whenever the protagonist hesitated or faltered. It was a constant reminder that some battles were fought in silence, inside the mind, rather than in open confrontation. After breakfast, the tension didn't ease. The protagonist had to get ready for school, each movement observed as if under a microscope. The stepdad made a point of walking past him several times, checking that his shoes were polished, his clothes neat, his hair in place. If something was slightly off, a sharp comment would follow. It wasn't always anger, but the condescension stung just as much. The protagonist had learned to anticipate it, to brace himself against the inevitable criticism. It was exhausting, but it also fueled a quiet determination to find a way to assert himself without direct confrontation. At school, life was a temporary escape. The classrooms felt less like walls and more like open skies, a place where the protagonist could breathe freely for a few hours. Friends noticed the tension at home and offered support, but even there, the shadow of the stepdad lingered. Every message home, every reminder, every slight delay could set off another chain of punishments or lectures. It was a life lived under constant surveillance, where freedom was measured in inches. The protagonist wasn't naive. He knew the stepdad's type: wealthy, kind of man who believed in total control, who saw respect as something to be demanded rather than earned. He also knew that direct confrontation would only escalate the situation. The key, he realized, was patience, observation, and strategy. If he was going to survive and eventually thrive, he had to play the long game. After school, tension returned home, heavier than the morning. The stepdad was always there, waiting, ready to scrutinize. The protagonist walked in quietly, careful to appear calm and compliant. He greeted his stepdad politely, but without the forced bow that was expected. It was a small act of defiance, subtle, but enough to test boundaries. The stepdad noticed immediately, his eyes narrowing with displeasure. "You think you can just walk in here and ignore the rules?" The stepdad demanded, voice low but sharp. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge, a test of will. The protagonist kept his expression neutral, swallowing the irritation that bubbled beneath the surface. He answered calmly, carefully choosing words that wouldn't provoke further anger. "I followed the rules I was taught, sir. I'm just trying to be respectful in my own way." The stepdad's son snickered from the corner of the room, enjoying the confrontation like it was a spectator sport. The mother, again caught in the middle, placed a gentle hand on the protagonist's shoulder, a silent reassurance that he wasn't alone. But the stepdad wasn't convinced. He demanded a demonstration, a bow, and when the protagonist hesitated, he issued a punishment. Nothing extremes, just enough to assert dominance, but enough to sting. Grounding, extra chores, and a lecture that lasted for what felt like hours. Yet, despite the punishment, the protagonist's resolve only strengthened. Each scolding, each unfair expectation, each small act of humiliation became fuel for a fire he kept hidden inside. He knew he couldn't win by arguing, shouting, or rebelling outright. The battle was mental, a game of strategy and patience. He had to find a way to turn the situation around, to regain control without giving the stepdad the satisfaction of an outright confrontation. Evenings were quiet, almost eerily so. The stepdad retreated to his study, the son to his room, leaving the protagonist with a few precious moments of peace. He would sit at the window, watching the world outside, thinking through his plans, analyzing every interaction, every word, every glance. Small victories became his focus. A conversation where he remained calm under pressure. A task completed without criticism, a silent act of defiance that went unnoticed. Each one was a step towards something bigger. Something that the stepdad would never anticipate. His mother often joined him, sensing the weight he carried. She didn't offer solutions. She knew better than to interfere directly, but she listened. Sometimes that was enough. Just having someone acknowledge the unfairness, someone who saw the struggle without judgment, provided a small measure of relief. Her presence reminded him that even in a home ruled by rigid authority, love could exist in quiet, understated ways. Nightfall brought a temporary reprieve. The stepdad's rules were still in place, the expectations still looming, but for a few hours. The protagonist could breathe. He wrote in his journal, detailing every incident, every slight, every thought. It was his sanctuary, a place to reflect, plan, and grow stronger. Each entry became a step in a larger strategy, a blueprint for a move that the stepdad would never see coming. As he drifted off to sleep, the protagonist felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. Life with his stepdad was far from fair, but it was shaping him in ways nothing else could. He was learning patience, observation, resilience, and strategy. Most importantly, he was learning that respect couldn't be forced, it had to be earned. Sometimes you had to earn it on your own terms. And deep down, he knew that one day, the moment would come when all the tension, all the unfairness, and all the small humiliations would culminate in a move that would change everything. The next day started in much the same way as the one before. The protagonist woke to the familiar weight pressing down on his chest. The knowledge that every movement, every word would be scrutinized. The morning light streamed through the curtains, but it felt harsh rather than comforting. Breakfast was tense, as usual. The stepdad sat with an air of expectation, his eyes scanning the table, searching for the slightest sign of disobedience. The son, next to him, seemed to sense an opportunity for amusement, leaning back with that same smug grin. The protagonist felt a mix of anger and frustration rising in his chest. The rule about bowing to his stepbrother was still in place, unspoken but enforced. Today, he decided he would try something different. Not out of rebellion, exactly, but out of careful testing. He would follow the rules to the letter, but he would also assert his dignity in small, calculated ways. The tension in the air made it feel like every step could spark a wildfire, yet he knew he had to move carefully. Breakfast passed in a blur of careful actions. He kept his head down when necessary, but refused the exaggerated bow. When the stepdad questioned his posture, he responded with calm, polite words, each one chosen to avoid angering the man while still holding his ground. His mother watched from the kitchen, a quiet observer of the unspoken battle. She didn't intervene, knowing that he needed to learn to navigate the storm himself, but her eyes followed him, full of empathy. The stepdad's reaction was immediate. He frowned, his lips pressing into a thin line. The son laughed quietly, enjoying the subtle tension. Then came the punishment. It was designed to assert control without being overtly cruel. Chores that seemed endless, lectures that stretched on about respect, obedience, and the importance of family hierarchy. The protagonist endured it silently, letting the anger simmer quietly, knowing that patience was part of his strategy. He had learned that outward resistance would only provoke harsher consequences. After the punishment, the protagonist retreated to his room, where he could breathe and think. He reflected on the previous day, on the growing tension at home, and on the subtle power dynamics that ruled their lives. Each scolding and small humiliation had taught him something. He was learning to read the stepdad's moods, to anticipate the triggers that led to anger, and to plan his actions accordingly. It was a mental game, a chess match in which every move counted. School was a welcome relief, a temporary escape. In class, he could focus on lessons rather than surviving the storm at home. He interacted with friends, though he often held back, careful not to reveal the full weight of his situation. Even so, the strain was noticeable. He carried it like a shadow. Teachers occasionally noticed the tension, offering kind words or gentle encouragement, but nothing could fully alleviate the constant vigilance he had to maintain. After school, he returned home to find the stepdad waiting, as always, for the slightest misstep. The chores were relentless, but he moved through them with a quiet determination. He realized that endurance was as important as cleverness. If he could withstand the small injustices, he would eventually create an opening, a chance to assert himself in a way the stepdad would never see coming. The protagonist began paying closer attention to the stepdad's habits. He noticed how the man became tense at certain times, distracted when dealing with multiple tasks, and proud when asserting dominance over his son. These observations were small pieces of a larger puzzle, pieces that would eventually allow him to make a move that would shift the balance of power in his favor. Evenings were quiet, but filled with the hum of unspoken tension. The stepdad would retreat to his study, leaving the house in a tense silence, broken only by the son's occasional laughter or the mother's soft movements in the kitchen. The protagonist used this time to plan, to write, to strategize. Each small act of observation, each note in his journal, became a tool for the future. He imagined scenarios where he could subtly undermine the unfair expectations, gain the upper hand, or at least create a moment where the stepdad's authority would be challenged without confrontation. One night, after finishing the day's chores and surviving another round of lectures, he sat by the window, looking out at the world beyond. The street was quiet, the houses bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. It was a peaceful scene, a stark contrast to the storm at home. He took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill his lungs, and felt a surge of determination. The world outside seemed vast and full of possibilities, and he realized that the battle at home was just one of many he would face in life. He had to be smart, patient, and calculated. Impulsiveness would only lead to failure. He thought about the day's interactions, about the moments when he had stood his ground, and about the subtle ways he had resisted the stepdad's control. Each one was a small victory, a test of patience and strategy. He knew he needed to build on these moments, to create a pattern of quiet strength that would eventually culminate in a decisive action. The plan was taking shape, and he could feel the first threads of it weaving together. His mother came in quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. She didn't speak, but her presence was comforting. He felt a sense of solidarity, a reminder that he wasn't completely alone. Her understanding and quiet support were invaluable, a counterbalance to the harshness of the stepdad's authority. She had seen the unfairness, the tension, and the careful navigation required, and though she could not intervene directly, her presence reminded him that he had allies in subtle ways. As the night deepened, the protagonist lay in bed, thinking about the challenges ahead. He reviewed every incident, every scolding, every small humiliation, looking for patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities. The stepdad was confident in his control, but overconfidence often hides blind spots. The protagonist intended to find them, to exploit them, and to create a moment of unexpected triumph. He didn't seek revenge, He sought justice, balance, and dignity. The tension at home was like a pressure cooker, and he understood that patience was key. Each day was a test of endurance, intelligence, and emotional control. He was learning skills that went beyond survival: observation, strategy, patience, and the quiet assertion of one's own values. He imagined a day when he could navigate the household without fear, when respect would be mutual rather than demanded. That day felt distant, but each small act of resilience brought it closer. Sleep came eventually, though it was uneasy. Dreams were a mix of fear and hope, reflections of the daily struggles and the plans forming in his mind. He woke the next morning with the same weight pressing down, but also with a renewed sense of purpose. The day ahead would bring its usual challenges, but he felt stronger, more aware, and more determined. Each punishment, each lecture, each small act of injustice was not just a trial to endure, it was a lesson. A building block in the larger strategy he was carefully constructing, and so the days continued. Each one a careful dance of observation, patience, and subtle resistance. The protagonist knew the stepdad would never see his ultimate move coming. It was hidden in plain sight, growing quietly, deliberately, like roots beneath the soil, waiting for the right moment to break through and change everything. Days passed, and the protagonist's quiet determination continued to grow. He had learned to read the subtle cues of his stepdad's moods. Noticing how certain words or gestures triggered either pride or irritation, he was beginning to see times when the stepdad's attention drifted, moments when he was distracted, and situations where his authority could be challenged without overt confrontation. Every observation added a piece to the puzzle, and the protagonist carefully stored each one in his mind. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about planning. He realized that endurance alone would not be enough. The stepdad expected obedience and control, but he had overlooked the possibility that someone could outthink him. The protagonist began sketching ideas, mentally rehearsing small maneuvers that could shift the balance of power subtly. It was a mental game, but he treated it seriously, studying the household like a chessboard where every move had consequences. His mother noticed a change in him. He was calmer, more thoughtful, and more strategic. She didn't press for details, understanding that he needed space to work through his plan. Yet, she offered quiet support in ways that mattered. A reassuring glance, a cup of tea placed on his desk, a gentle word when he seemed wary, all small gestures that reminded him he wasn't alone in this struggle. These moments of support strengthened his resolve and provided emotional fuel for the careful work he was undertaking. The stepdad continued his rigid enforcement of rules. Bowing, obedience, and immediate compliance were still expected, and any deviation brought punishment. But the protagonist had learned to comply outwardly while maintaining his inner dignity. He discovered ways to follow the rules precisely, but with subtle gestures or phrasing that preserved his sense of self. It was a delicate balance, walking the line between obedience and assertion. Between survival and quiet resistance, school offered brief respite. But even there, he carried the lessons he was learning at home. Observation, patience, and strategy became part of his daily routine. He paid attention to how authority worked in other settings: teachers, classmates, and coaches, all small lessons that could be applied at home. Every interaction was a chance to practice subtle control, to experiment with tactics, and to prepare for the eventual move he had been planning. One afternoon, he returned home to find the stepdad in an unusually irritable mood. Small mistakes in the household seemed magnified, and the son appeared eager to amplify the tension. The protagonist moved carefully, performing his chores with meticulous attention to detail. Every action was calculated to avoid immediate conflict while still asserting a degree of independence. He was learning to navigate high-pressure situations without losing his composure, a skill that would become crucial in executing his plan. That evening, he retreated to his room, where he began laying out the framework for his plan. It was not impulsive or vengeful. It was strategic, thoughtful, and deliberate. He considered every possible reaction from the stepdad, every potential obstacle, and every subtle leverage point. The plan required patience, timing, and precision. He visualized the moment when all the pieces would come together, when the stepdad's authority could be challenged in a way that was undeniable yet nonviolent. He also reflected on the importance of perception. The stepdad thrived on appearances and public displays of control. The protagonist realized that a well-timed action, performed in the right context, could create a moment where the stepdad's rigid image of authority would crumble. It was about psychology as much as strategy, anticipating the reactions of everyone in the household, including his mother and stepbrother. Each detail mattered, and he took notes quietly in his journal, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. At night, he would sit by the window, gazing at the quiet streets outside. The calmness contrasted sharply with the storm of tension inside the house, offering clarity of thought. He imagined scenarios where his plan succeeded, rehearsing each step mentally. In these quiet moments, he felt a sense of empowerment. He was no longer just reacting to the stepdad's rules. He was preparing to take control in a way that the man could not anticipate. Meanwhile, the stepdad's son continued to enjoy a sense of superiority, unaware of the mental chess being played against him. The protagonist observed his reactions, noting how pride and expectation influenced his behavior. Even small missteps by the son provided insight into the family dynamics, information that would later become crucial. Every observation added a layer of understanding. Sharpening the strategy and increasing the likelihood of success, the protagonist's patience was tested repeatedly. There were moments of frustration when the stepdad's unfairness seemed unbearable, and times when the stepbrother's teasing felt relentless. Yet, he learned to channel these emotions into focus, transforming anger and frustration into careful calculation. He knew that any rash move could backfire, undoing all the progress he had made. Self-control became both a shield and a tool, allowing him to operate under pressure without revealing the depth of his plan. Small victories reinforced his confidence. A chore completed without criticism, a polite response that diffused tension, a moment of composure in the face of scolding. All these instances became building blocks for the eventual execution of his strategy. Each success, no matter how minor, was celebrated quietly as evidence that patience and careful planning could triumph over coercion and intimidation. He also strengthened his observational skills beyond the immediate household. He noticed how authority worked in different settings, how people reacted to unfairness, and how subtle gestures or words could influence outcomes. These lessons were integrated into his mental framework, enhancing his ability to predict behavior and plan moves in advance. He became increasingly aware of the interplay between power, respect, and perception. Recognizing that true influence often lay in strategy rather than force, the protagonist began documenting his observations in a detailed journal, noting triggers, reactions, patterns, and potential opportunities. Each entry was a strategic analysis, a preparation for the moment when his plan would be set in motion. The act of writing clarified his thinking and reinforced his sense of control. It also provided a tangible record of his progress, a reminder that he was actively shaping his circumstances rather than merely enduring them. One evening, after completing his routine chores and avoiding another confrontation, he sat with his mother. They shared a quiet conversation, not about specific plans, but about the challenges he faced and the lessons he had learned. Her support was subtle, yet profound, offering emotional grounding and a sense of solidarity. These moments reminded him that resilience was not about isolation. It was strengthened by understanding and connection with those who cared. As nights passed, his focus sharpened. He mentally rehearsed different scenarios, predicting the stepdad's responses and adjusting his strategy accordingly. He imagined the precise moment when the stepdad's overconfidence would provide an opening, and he planned how to act decisively without aggression. Every detail mattered, from timing to wording to demeanor. It was a complex, delicate operation, but he approached it with patience and meticulous care. Through this process, the protagonist discovered inner strength he hadn't known he possessed. He realized that endurance, observation, strategy could transform a seemingly hopeless situation into one of potential empowerment. The unfairness and tension at home became not just challenges to endure, but lessons to master, preparing him for the eventual moment of action. By the end of this period, he was no longer simply a teenager navigating a tense household. He had become a strategist, a patient observer, and a calculated thinker. Each day, each interaction, each subtle act of compliance or resistance added layers to his understanding and sharpened his ability to act decisively. The groundwork was laid, and the stage was being set for the move that would finally shift the balance of power in his favor. He was ready, and though the moment had not yet come, could feel it approaching, inevitable and unmistakable. The days of observation, patience, and quiet planning finally began to pay off. The protagonist had spent weeks learning the household rhythms, studying the stepdad's habits, and noting the smallest cracks in the armor of authority. Now he knew it was time to act, not with anger or rebellion, but with intelligence, timing, and subtlety that the stepdad would never anticipate. It started with small, seemingly insignificant actions. He would perform tasks with extra care, adding small touches that made the stepdad believe everything was under control. He spoke politely, used careful wording, and maintained composure, all while subtly steering interactions toward moments that favored him. The stepdad, confident in his control, did not notice the careful groundwork being laid. It was a quiet shift, imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention. But it set the stage for a larger outcome. One afternoon, the protagonist noticed that the stepdad had become particularly preoccupied with work-related stress. The opportunity presented itself almost naturally. He volunteered for additional responsibilities around the house, presenting them as acts of compliance and respect. The stepdad, already absorbed in his own concerns, barely registered the gesture beyond mild acknowledgement. This moment of apparent submission was actually a strategic move, creating trust and lowering the stepdad's guard. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued to observe his stepbrother. He noticed that the boy relied heavily on the stepdad's approval for his own confidence and behavior. This insight would later become a critical part of the plan. By influencing the son subtly, he could affect the stepdad indirectly, without confrontation, creating a situation where authority could be challenged safely and effectively. The protagonist also began to document subtle inconsistencies and moments of overconfidence in his stepdad. Every word, gesture, and reaction became data. He considered how these details could be used to shift perceptions in his favor. It was not about humiliation or revenge. It was about balance, respect, and the assertion of dignity that had long been denied to him. Each observation brought him closer to a move that would finally provide a tangible outcome from weeks of patience. Evenings were the time for preparation and reflection. He would sit quietly in his room, reviewing every detail, rehearsing potential scenarios, and refining his approach. The plan required a delicate balance of timing, wording, and emotional control. Any misstep could unravel weeks of careful preparation. Yet, he felt a sense of excitement and empowerment. For the first time in weeks, he was not reacting to authority. He was shaping events proactively. He began to test the boundaries subtly. A polite question here, a carefully timed suggestion there. Each act seemed innocuous, but cumulatively, they began to create shifts in the household dynamic. The stepdad, caught in the routine of daily enforcement, did not notice the small cracks forming in his perceived absolute control. The protagonist's mother noticed subtle changes too, though she kept quiet, offering support through her silent approval and small gestures that reinforced his confidence. One evening, the pivotal opportunity arrived. The stepdad and his son were engaged in a conversation where the son's behavior reflected his own pride and reliance on his father's approval. The protagonist recognized the moment as perfect for action. He approached, calm and composed, carrying himself with a quiet authority that contrasted with his usual deference. He asked a question, phrased carefully to invite discussion, but also to subtly challenge the assumptions underpinning the stepdad's control. The words were neutral, almost innocuous, but their timing and context were perfect. The stepdad's reaction was immediate but restrained. He responded with authority, but the protagonist maintained composure, reinforcing the subtle psychological shift. The son, caught in the middle, began to realize that his own behavior and confidence were influenced by more than just the stepdad's approval. It was a turning point that no one fully understood in the moment, but that would have cascading effects in the coming days. The protagonist continued to act with precision. Every task, conversation, and interaction was part of a broader strategy. He made sure to maintain outward compliance while influencing perceptions subtly. The stepdad's focus on appearances and control meant he did not anticipate that these small, careful maneuvers were gradually shifting the balance of authority in the household. It was a delicate dance of influence strategy and psychological insight. As the days progressed, the effects became more apparent. The stepdad's overconfidence began to show. Small inconsistencies emerged. His son began to exhibit signs of independent thought that had previously been suppressed. The protagonist's patient, strategic approach had begun to yield tangible results. The household dynamics were changing, quietly but unmistakably. As the authority that had seemed absolute became more negotiable, more open to subtle influence. Throughout this period, the protagonist maintained his internal focus. He did not gloat, nor did he act impulsively. Each action was deliberate, aimed at long-term outcomes rather than immediate gratification. The tension that had dominated his life remained present, but it was now tempered by the knowledge that his careful planning was beginning to pay off. The sense of empowerment grew, reinforcing his patience and strategic thinking. He continued to document observations, refining his plan based on real-time feedback. Every reaction from the stepdad and his son was analyzed, every opportunity for influence noted. The journal became both a record and a tool, allowing him to track progress and adapt the strategy dynamically. This process reinforced the idea that resilience, intelligence, patience could achieve what direct confrontation never could. By the end of the week, the household felt subtly different. The stepdad's authority, though still present, was no longer absolute. The protagonist's careful influence had created small but significant shifts in behavior, perception, and confidence. The son began to question assumptions quietly, and the stepdad focused on external matters. Failed to notice the gradual change occurring under his nose. It was a quiet revolution, the result of patience, intelligence, and meticulous planning. The protagonist's mother watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. She had witnessed the weeks of endurance, observation, and strategy, and now she saw the first tangible signs of success. Her subtle support had been part of the process, reinforcing confidence and resilience. The family dynamic, once dominated by rigid control and tension, had begun to move toward a more balanced state. Though the final transformation had yet to occur, late at night, the protagonist reflected on the week's events, felt a mix of relief, satisfaction, and anticipation. The plan had worked precisely as intended, laying the groundwork for the next stage. He understood that patience and strategy were as important as courage, and that true influence often required subtlety rather than force. The tension that had once felt suffocating now felt like a challenge that could be met, understood, and ultimately redirected. In these quiet moments, he also realized the personal growth he had achieved. He was calmer, more observant, more strategic, and more self-aware. The experiences had honed his ability to navigate difficult situations, understand human behavior, and act decisively when opportunity arose. He had discovered strength he hadn't known he possessed, and he understood that the ultimate resolution was within reach. And so, with each calculated step, the protagonist moved closer to the decisive moment he had envisioned. The groundwork was complete. The small shifts in perception and behavior had been achieved, and the stage was set. The stepdad, confident in his control and unaware of the subtle revolution underway, remained oblivious to the strategic influence quietly shaping the household. The protagonist's patience, intelligence, and careful planning were finally paying off, setting the scene for a turning point that would change everything. The moment the protagonist had been preparing for finally arrived. Weeks of careful observation, subtle testing, and quiet planning had all led to this day. He awoke with a sense of purpose, knowing that patience and strategy had created the perfect opportunity to act. The air in the house felt different, charged with the usual tension but layered with potential. Today, he would not only assert his own dignity but also subtly challenge the unfair expectations that had weighed on him for so long. The morning began like any other. Breakfast was tense, the stepdad sitting at the head of the table, his son lounging nearby, confident in his perceived dominance. The protagonist moved deliberately, performing his routine with careful composure. He greeted both of them politely, without the exaggerated deference that had been demanded. The stepdad noticed, of course, but he was distracted by work and the day's schedule, unaware that this small act was part of a larger plan. The protagonist's mother watched quietly, a knowing expression on her face. She had seen the preparation, the mental rehearsals, and the careful maneuvers. Her subtle encouragement had helped him build confidence, though she said nothing aloud, letting him navigate the moment on his own. Her presence was a silent support, reminding him that he had allies even when it seemed he was alone. After breakfast, the protagonist moved through his chores and routines with calm efficiency. Each task was performed flawlessly, giving the impression of obedience while maintaining an inner confidence. The stepdad's focus remained divided, giving the protagonist the subtle advantage he had been waiting for. Observed every reaction, every glance, noting how the stepdad's confidence fluctuated when minor details were handled perfectly. The opportunity to act came unexpectedly. The stepdad and his son were involved in a conversation that revolved around the son's accomplishments and the importance of respect and obedience. The protagonist approached calmly, carrying himself with quiet authority. He asked a question, phrased carefully, that challenged an assumption the stepdad had made. The words were polite, almost casual, but they carried weight, causing both the stepdad and his son to pause and consider. The stepdad's reaction was immediate. His eyes narrowed, a flash of surprise crossing his face. He opened his mouth to assert control, but the protagonist's calm, measured response diffused the tension. It was a demonstration of mental strength and strategic thinking rather than confrontation. The son, watching intently, began to see the dynamics differently, recognizing that confidence and respect could be earned in ways other than fear or obedience. The protagonist continued to build on the moment. He engaged in a conversation that highlighted fairness, patience, and understanding, subtly exposing inconsistencies in the stepdad's rigid approach. Each statement was deliberate, each question calculated to encourage reflection rather than provoke anger. The stepdad, confident in his authority, but unprepared for such subtle challenge, found himself reconsidering the automatic assumptions he had held about control and respect. Throughout the day, the protagonist maintained this careful balance of assertiveness and composure. He handled tasks, conversations, and interactions with precision, reinforcing the subtle shifts he had created over weeks of preparation. Each action was a step toward a broader outcome, one that would restore balance and dignity without aggression or rebellion. By evening, the effects were clear. The stepdad's authority, while still present, had been tempered by recognition of the protagonist's composure, intelligence, and independence. The son, too, began to adjust his behavior, showing respect that was earned rather than demanded. The household dynamic, once dominated by tension and rigid control, had begun to shift toward a more balanced state. It was a quiet revolution, the result of patience, observation, and strategic action. The protagonist's mother quietly acknowledged the change, her eyes filled with pride and relief. She had witnessed the weeks of preparation, the careful planning, and the strategic execution, and now she saw the results. The household, once fraught with tension, had begun to move toward understanding, respect, and balance. The protagonist had achieved a victory not through confrontation, but through intelligence, patience, and subtle influence. As night fell, the protagonist reflected on the events of the day. He felt a mix of satisfaction, relief, and empowerment. The plan he had meticulously crafted had succeeded, transforming the household dynamics in a profound yet subtle way. He had not sought revenge or humiliation. He had sought fairness, respect, and dignity, and he had achieved it through careful thought, patience, and strategic action. He documented the events in his journal, noting the reactions, the subtle shifts in behavior, and the insights gained. It was a record of triumph, a testament to the power of patience, observation, and strategy. The process had strengthened his resilience, enhanced his understanding of human behavior, and provided him with skills that would serve him well beyond the confines of the household in the quiet of the night. He looked out the window, feeling a sense of closure and accomplishment. The tension that had weighed heavily for so long had been transformed into a sense of empowerment and understanding. He realized that true influence comes not from force or intimidation, but from intelligence, patience, and strategic action. He had demonstrated that respect could be earned in ways that were thoughtful, deliberate, and non-confrontational. The household, though still imperfect, felt different. The stepdad, once rigid and commanding, had begun to recognize the protagonist's inner strength and intelligence. The son, once reliant on unquestioned approval, had started to understand the value of earned respect. The mother, quietly supportive throughout, had witnessed the transformation and felt relief at the subtle yet profound change in family dynamics. The protagonist felt a deep sense of personal growth. He had navigated a challenging and unfair situation with intelligence and patience, turning tension and adversity into an opportunity for empowerment. The experience had taught him resilience, strategic thinking, emotional control, and the value of observation. He had learned that challenges could be overcome not through confrontation or aggression, but through careful planning, patience, and subtle influence. As he drifted to sleep, he felt a sense of peace. The plan had succeeded. The household had begun to shift toward balance, and he had proven to himself that intelligence and patience could triumph over rigid authority. He understood that life would continue to present challenges, but he now possessed the skills, confidence, and resilience to navigate them successfully. The tension and struggle that had once defined his days had been transformed into a story of quiet triumph, strategic thinking, and personal growth.